What is environmental pollution? Environmental pollution can be anything from temperatures to chemicals to changes in atmospheric conditions. All kinds of things come into play. And when we look at these changes, what we're going to focus on and think about is just a couple of examples with you today. These can, of course, extend to all kinds of different things, and you may think of some that I don't talk about. But we look at aquatic pollutants, right? Anything that is going to move typically from the terrestrial or land to the water. So this might be things like pesticides. We get a lot of runoff from farm fields into rivers and then into oceans, and it affects the coral reefs. We can look at sulfur as being a pretty significant change to different conditions, changes to given areas that will influence aquatic ecosystems. We can look at things like the ozone layer. We have tied changes in the ozone layer to atmospheric pollutants, particularly looking at CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. CFCs were banned in the U.S. a number of decades ago now, but we are still seeing residual effects, and they are not banned worldwide. So these are aerosols, a chemical used in aerosol cans, and the idea that we have banned them, and on many of your aerosol cans now you see the no CFC symbol on the back, but we still see lingering effects from that. We also look at CO2 levels as being a very significant contributor to the ozone layer, and we'll talk more about that. Nutrient pollutions from fertilizers, again, like we mentioned with the water cycle, we have to deal with runoff. Nitrogen is the primary one we worry about. Phosphorus is another. Nitrogen we see contributing huge amounts to algal blooms in oceans and so on. So changes in the ozone hole have become pretty significant over time. And what we're looking at is ozone is measured in something known as Dobson units. And we won't get into all the details of that, but think about it as a relative scale for our purposes here. And as you see, what we'd really like is to be in this kind of red region at the high end of our Dobson scale. But what we're seeing a lot of in our figures here are this blue circle, particularly over Antarctica. So we're looking at the bottom of the planet here, right? This is Antarctica. And so we see changes in this ozone hole. And you might look at 2002 and go, that was a really nice year. There's very little blue. That's terrific. There's some red down here. Maybe we're fixing the problem. But it turns out that the ozone hole shifts dramatically, of course, with changes in atmospheric conditions, and we haven't really fixed the problem, but the idea that we are getting some additional yellow down here in the southern hemisphere is a good sign. Will we ever go back to no ozone hole? Probably not. There's now one over the North Pole as well, extends down through Canada, and if it continues at its current rate, will actually extend into the northern U.S., including Michigan and Maine. We have a problem every year with changes in runoff of nitrogen from fertilizer. In the Midwest, it comes down the Mississippi River and empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And what you see here are dissolved oxygen levels. So the red are very, very bad. Okay, and that means that we have very low oxygen in the water. All of the organisms dependent on oxygen in the water, fish, invertebrates, everything that breathes oxygen, right, is very dependent on that oxygen level. So where's it going? This happens in late spring, early summer, almost every year. We see varying sizes of this space or sizes of this coverage of what's going on. But what we're looking at is nitrogen flowing down the Mississippi River. So it's coming down over here and into the Gulf of Mexico, and a number of other rivers as well. But the biggest one contributing to this is the Mississippi, bringing in nitrogen that has run off fields, farm fields in the Midwest. It travels down the river and reaches the Gulf of Mexico. And when it does, the algae they're plants, are very dependent on nitrogen for growth and typically are nitrogen limited. We've discussed nitrogen limitations before, and when we look at adding nitrogen to the water, we've essentially just fertilized the algae. They grow to huge numbers. And you might think, well, okay, but algae is a plant. It should produce oxygen. True. But the problem is the nitrogen makes the algae grow so large, population grows so large, that they outcompete one another. The algae die. They fall to the bottom. They feed decomposers. The decomposers use oxygen. So we see a spike in the algae population, followed by a spike in the decomposer population. And when that happens, we see the decomposers using up huge amounts of oxygen, and we eventually see the oxygen levels dip to the point where the fish die and the small invertebrates and so on. Now, this will eventually clear out over the summer. Stirring of the ocean will actually help to redistribute the oxygen, and we'll get it back into this area. The fish will return. But if we continue on this path, we see a lot more of this every year, and we'll continue to see this dead zone increase more and more every year at the mouth of the Mississippi. We also get concerned about something known as biomagnification, or some of you may know it as bioaccumulation. So this is essentially a food chain problem. There are small organisms that are going to be taking up pollutants in the environment. Those small organisms are eaten by larger organisms in high quantities. Those larger organisms are eaten by even larger organisms, and so on. And this is actually looking at PCBs in particular. PCBs were a common pollutant. We still see them quite a bit, but they were a very common pollutant in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We saw a lot going on with PCBs, and there was a great focus on it because it causes the eggshells of birds to thin. So if you can imagine your chicken egg, imagine that that shell is thinner. So now what happens when you squeeze that chicken egg? It could break, right, very easily. And so that's what was happening, is these shells of the birds were breaking before the birds were grown up inside the shell ready to hatch, and they would all die. So we saw huge declines in bird populations because little tiny phytoplankton were taking up PCBs in the environment and bioaccumulating, or adding up. So think about adding at every level based on the number of organisms you eat. And so they give you some numbers here, looking particularly at accumulation of PCBs in the tissues of organisms, all the way up through a porpoise in this case. Okay, so parts per billion seems like a fairly small number until you're talking about 17,000 parts per billion, right? These are huge numbers that we have to deal with in the environment because they're influencing our populations.